The Senate File 2113 that passed in 2018 required trainings on adverse childhood experiences. This act was really to ensure all educators in Iowa are exposed to the information on ACEs and toxic stress, but it does not require, and the DE won't be issuing specific guidance on specific training or a list of specific instructions. So our intent is really to make sure that those who are receiving this training get a lot of basic understanding and some core initial responses. We also really want to emphasize when we deliver this training that it is a training, not a culture shift. While anytime we do a training, there's a lot of great exposure to important information. It doesn't mean that your school has automatically shifted to trauma-informed school or trauma-sensitive. One training will not do that. However, those initial trainings and those who have made the shift to trauma-informed schools will say that those initial trainings and presentations were a very, very critical piece of that work. The last thing to note related to this slide, we have listed on here 2 key resources. We typically refer to 211. The other one listed on here is the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Iowa, their hotline. The learning objectives that we provide to folks are listed here: learning the facts, seeing the opportunities, and experiencing hope. Now, I certainly don't expect anyone from this training to become a brain scientist and feel like you can accurately explain and answer all questions about brain development. So we've tried to include just a few key points here that we think are effective and easy to communicate. So we include some core facts about what we know about ACEs and what we know about brain development. When we talk opportunities, we'll explore some strategies and some examples. We'll also do a brief connection to suicide. We know and we would expect, this is not meant to be a suicide prevention and postvention training, so we know and expect that every district is going to have something in addition to an ACEs and toxic stress training. And then lastly, and how I always start a presentation, is that emphasis on hope. And then I always come back at the end of presentations to that emphasis on hope, because this can sometimes be very heavy content. Focusing on that, having this information, and being able to make decisions and make school change, district change, state level change based off of this information is really a hopeful place to be. So the first section that we'll go through is the facts. We define what toxic stress is on this slide. It's actually a definition of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and we talk about the impact on brain development. We talk about stress being a protective mechanism, that it allows us, and over the course of our evolution has allowed us to outrun predators or fight off attackers. When we are exposed to that small amount of stress, our body When we have appropriate supports and the danger is appropriately removed, our body undergoes a process where that danger recedes and our body recovers. When we have toxic stress or that prolonged stress, our body does not understand how or may not be allowed to recover. And that level of stress does overwhelm our bodies, and it can become very toxic and have physiological and mental health impacts. When that stress occurs without adequate adult support or other support services, that it can actually disrupt brain development and your other organ systems over time. When that occurs prolonged, when it occurs repeatedly, intensely, it can take a cumulative toll on mental health for a lifetime. We'll briefly discuss the ACEs research, but as many of you know, with the ACEs research, that long-term physical health impact is caused by this prolonged activation of the stress response system. So then we move on to talk about how toxic stress can derail and impact healthy development. Positive stress levels, or what I sometimes will reflect to is as the green light of stress. It allows our body to efficiently and appropriately respond to stress. We give examples here of, in the education setting, how this may impact students. So for example, a student has a big test coming up and they're anxious the week leading up to it. Hopefully, for most students, not all, but for most students, when the test is done and complete, they are able to recover from that stress and not have some long-term impacts from it. Tolerable stress is when serious things happen, maybe very dangerous things happen, and it includes that major flood of stress hormones. This can be really challenging. However, when we have appropriate supports in place, when we have adequate adult supports, peer supports, that individual is able to recover and get through that tolerable stress. So the example that's listed here is a student who's in a car accident, hospital stay, a long period of recovery, friends and family visit during the hospital stay, there's good connection, and that student's able to remain relatively positive and supportive throughout that process. The last example listed here is toxic stress. So again, that prolonged activation of the stress response system. Another way to describe this is if our body is constantly poised to defeat the bear in the woods, because that's what our evolution is, to get away from predators. But if you don't have those additional supports, the bear is always there. So the example given here with that prolonged activation of stress response system is a student who has a parent with a history of substance abuse. They may not be able to predict when they're in danger. They may constantly be activated and on high alert. They may constantly feel like their body needs to be primed to fight, flight, or freeze. History, their personal history, their history with their family and with their adults, has shown them that this is the appropriate way to respond because their body is hardwired to respond to that danger because they know it's always likely. So you may say, well, we are in a school. This is a safe environment. But the student doesn't necessarily know that. Their body doesn't necessarily know that. So even though the school environment may not seem threatening from our perspective, to the student, they feel like they need to be on high alert at all times. When we look at stress on the body, toxic stress in the education setting can impact the ability to focus, to learn, to engage with other individuals, to calm down or regulate their emotions, and to make good decisions. This is not how every student who's impacted by toxic stress will respond. It's very unique to the individuals, but these are some of the most common things that research identifies that is seen. The example that's given is that a person or a student who's regularly flooded by stress, they may be sick more often. They may have increased inflammatory issues, problems with their immune function, and even long-term structural changes to their brain once they reach adulthood. So when we think of things like absenteeism, being sick, frequent visits to the nurse's office, these are all examples of things that we may see in the education field. This is where we dive in more specifically to ACEs research. Again, we reference the definition that's given in the legislation. The original ACE study that was done back in the 90s looked at the long-term impact of trauma and toxic stress. Adverse childhood experiences in that original study were 10 incidents that dramatically upset the environments that children need to thrive. These are listed on the screen. A very important thing for you all who may be delivering this content to note is that trauma is personal. And what may be traumatic or viewed as trauma to a given individual is not the same as other individuals. This list also doesn't talk about every type of trauma, doesn't talk about trauma external to the home, and it doesn't account for the longevity or severity or trauma. This was purely on the incidence. The study's findings showed that ACEs were common. 2/3 experienced at least one type of trauma. ACEs tended to occur in clusters. When you experienced one type of trauma, there's co-occurrence with other types. So for example, the co-occurrence between domestic violence and something like incarceration of a parent or separation or divorce of parents. And that as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for physical and mental health issues. It's a stair-step relationship. We utilize on this slide the lasting impact on health. We utilize this chart and slide that comes directly from the CDC and the original researchers. And it notes here in the notes that ACEs have a link between health and social outcomes that are some of our most costly issues today. Many health issues relate to behavior, such as the more likely you are to smoke, the more likely you are to develop COPD, but some issues are unrelated. And the most important thing to impress when talking about the original ACE study was that this was really the first time that they could correlate the major health issues with childhood trauma. And the other thing that you can note, you see here in the notes, the dose-response relationship. So as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for a variety of negative health and well-being outcomes. You can also describe this as the stair-step relationship. We then include the ACEs pyramid, which is, according to the CDC, the mechanism by which ACEs influence health and well-being throughout the lifespan. According to the CDC, that link helped explain a scientific gap. Research in the 80s and 90s showed that risk factors such as smoking, alcohol use, and sexual behaviors for many common diseases were not randomly distributed, and that the risk factors often clustered. So that is, a person who had one risk factor tended to have more. The ACEs study provided the link from adverse childhood experiences to these risk factors, and this pyramid tries to help explain that. So that childhood adversity can cause disrupted neurological development, which then can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. According to this model, those that experience an adverse event may experience that disrupted neurodevelopment and lead them to adopting those risky behaviors, sometimes as a coping mechanism in response to their stress. They may develop disease, disability, or other social problems. And finally, it can impact longevity, leading to early and loss of life. And that could be related to physical illness or mental illness. Some people do not believe trauma happens here, or that these things happen to kids, or even if they happen in Iowa, they don't happen in my community or they don't happen in my school. And so that's why we emphasize the importance of having that Iowa data. You'll see in the script, we give some specific details on Iowa data collection. We do that through the State Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System that's done by Iowa Department of Public Health. When we analyze the Iowa data, looking at 8 types of trauma, this does not include neglect, 56% of Iowa adults will report experiencing at least one of the 8 traumas, types of abuse or household dysfunction, and 14.5% will experience 4 or more ACEs, which we believe indicates a significant level of childhood trauma. So it's really important to emphasize when you're providing this information that it is not a problem affecting other people. It's something that we face in this state and in every single community. So when we talk about the health impact, we use really this one slide to talk about some of the key data points to show that that same stair-step progression is present in Iowa. That increased risk for health issues increases as the number of ACEs increases. So this chart gives that broad perspective. Compared to those with 0 ACEs, Iowa adults with 4 or more ACEs are twice as likely to say their health is poor, 2.5 times as likely to rate their mental health as poor, and 2.5 times as likely to report limitations in activities. This is where we provide a very brief link to ACEs and suicide. They do have a very high relationship. In some of the research that has come out in recent years, they say exposure to those high levels of adversity were linked to about 80% of suicide attempts. This isn't Iowa data. These are national data and research that is coming out, but I think it does help illustrate some of that link and link to other trainings that school staff or communities may have. As we discussed on the pyramid slide, early death could certainly be related to a physical illness, but could also be due to a mental health condition. Suicide in community can also be a source of stress for others. That's why it was very important that when that legislation passed last year, that it was suicide prevention and postvention and how to support the students and the community. The other thing that we will note related to ACEs is that ACEs are not the only stressors for students. So as we noted before, ACEs are not comprehensive. They don't include all types of trauma. They focus on the home. They're not focused on system or community issues. Things like historical trauma, epigenetics, social determinants of health were not included in the conventional ACEs. Emerging awareness, more national and community studies, we hope to have more of this in Iowa soon, include things like experiencing discrimination as a youth based off of your race, sexual orientation, place of birth, disability, or religion, feeling unsafe in your neighborhood, exposure to community violence or gun violence, bullying, involvement of foster care is increasingly becoming a very, very common data point in ACEs research, loss of a parent or guardian due to death, deportation or migration in your family, as well as experiencing medical trauma. So a youth who has a significant health issue or maybe chronic health issue that impacts them. So really what we find is that the rates of childhood adversity are underreported other communities have found when they've been able to take a deeper dive into these expanded ACEs, that we are significantly underreporting ACEs, and we anticipate that in Iowa too. And as I said, we're hoping in the next year or so we'll be able to show some of that data. This is from the RISE Foundation. We reference this pyramid that provides additional layers under ACEs to look at the social conditions, the local impact, as well as generational or historical trauma. Okay. In this facts section, and we then switch to information on toxic stress on brain development and learning. So we really emphasize, so how does all of this happen? It begins with a child's developing brain. A lot of brain development happens in those first 3 years of life. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but it's our, and brain architecture, but it's our experiences that really shape that long-term architecture and establish the foundation for learning, health, and behavior. This slide is a drawing of brain synapses, but at birth, we are, when we are born and in those first few years of life, we have an explosion in our brain synaptic growth. By adolescence, we begin a process of pruning. So the synapses that we use with repetition are strengthened, and those we don't use as much begin to weaken and disappear. As we're exposed to the same experiences over and over again, we tend to really strengthen and hone in on our responses to those particular experiences. So how does this relate to our education? If in our homes or if in our community, toxic stress is a normal part of our life, our elevated stress response systems become routine. How we react, how we regulate, even if they are not positive, become routine. Again, some of you have likely seen this brain scan before. This is a brain scan of, for lack of a better word, a healthy brain, and that of a severely neglected child, a Romanian orphan who was institutionalized shortly after birth. What was known as that the orphanage that this came from had been, the young people had experienced often extreme neglect, very little social interaction. And so it shows, for example, that an area that did not develop as well is the temporal lobes, and those are areas that we know to influence things like human emotions, attachment, and self-regulation. So the reason why we use this particular slide is to show that relationships, especially early relationships, when our brains are developing rapidly, can have an impact on our very physiology of our brain in the future. We also reference here the impact of toxic stress on brain development and learning. A child who experiences stress or ACEs may or may not exhibit obvious symptoms. They may have difficulty focusing in class, and they may be aggressive, or that maybe they just shut down, or even have an outburst when they go through stress in the classroom. Their flight, fight, or response system can be easily triggered at the slightest stressor, such as being asked to put something away or to stop doing something. To us as adults, and to us not understanding their experiences or history, it may not make sense to us why they are reacting the way they are reacting, but to that child or youth or teenager, if they've had a lifetime of experience showing them that is how to react, and that's how you react to protect yourself, it makes sense to their body and their stress response system. So on this list, you see some examples. Not all of them, again, are applicable to every child or youth, but these give examples. We often focus on those that are explosive or disruptive, but it's really important to note that there are a lot of kids who struggle in silence, and who just shut down and who do freeze when their body is flooded with stress. Specific to education, there are some really clear data coming out, particularly from states that have been involved in this work much longer, on how does it impact an education. So again, here I'd encourage you to engage the group. How do you identify students who might be struggling? How might it be impacting their learning or their health? How might we as professionals, as teachers, as administrators, as support staff, be impacted by the trauma that we know our students go through? And how does stress impact our lives? This chart demonstrates an odds ratio in a study by Chris Blodgett at the Clear Trauma Center. Teachers in an elementary school were asked to note the experiences, traumatic experiences of their students based off of just what they knew. And then data was collected on the student academics and attendance, behaviors, and health. And the study found that students with 4 or more ACEs were 3 times more likely to experience academic failure, 5 times more likely to have severe attendance problems, 6 times more likely to have behavior problems, and 4 times more likely to report poor health compared to those with no known ACEs. So our students are facing a great deal of stress, and stress has that profound impact on their brain development and success in school. And again, it's important to note, these are all the additional traumas on top of the typical stress we see with youth and young people in their development at this period of their life. So these are the additional things going on in the home or in the community that are impacting their academic success. I doubt anyone on this call would disagree with me that in general, childhood, youth, teenage years are stressful just in and of themselves for kids. Okay, it's a time of constant change. So we're talking about all the things on top of that. So we'll move on now to the next section, which is on the opportunities. And this is where we really shift to the solution focus, hope focus part of this work. While I clearly, by my job, I believe in the data and in the research on toxic stress and trauma, but the solution focus, the hope piece of it is so critical to creating change. And so that's as important part of this training as all the core facts. So when we look at resilience, we really encourage the group to say, well, what can we do? And there's a lot we can do. And so we ask for how folks, they themselves define resilience. Research on resilience shows that through all that stress and adversity, there can be a profound impact, but the story absolutely does not end there. There's a lot of public figures who talk about their trauma in childhood and were extremely successful. So not everyone who smokes will get lung cancer. Not everyone who experiences trauma will have difficulty. So what allows people to overcome that? There are so many factors that play into that for individuals, but resilience is a big one. Resilience is the capacity to recover from difficulties. It's the ability to bounce back after adverse times. Our lives are always capable of creating new pathways and new opportunities to overcome our traumatic histories. And our brain can heal even in adulthood. Now, when you're younger, it's much easier to do that healing, but there still can be a lot of healing in adulthood. The earlier we start to build resilience, the more positive the impact can be. Research behind resilient science shows that kids who have close relationships with caring adults have parents who are resilient, who have a sense of purpose, can self-regulate, who have access to things like mental health sources, good social or peer connections, are much more likely to overcome adversity than those who don't. educators to support staff to administrators, other leaders in the community, and they are all adults, which means that they can have a tremendous role in building resilience and have a tremendous role in being that support for a child or youth. Depending on where you live in Iowa, you may have heard this ARC term before, but a good summary of all this is the 3 categories of resilience: attachment, regulation, or competency. Children who have strong attachments, especially to caring adults, have mastered emotional regulation and feel competent, have a great set of skills to help them overcome adversity. You can develop and further foster these traits at any time. I know there's an organization who is part of our advisory group here in the Central Iowa region, and they work with youth, and their programming is focused on building up key resilience areas in their youth. So while they're certainly aware of some of the stressors that their youth face, they specifically focus their programming on developing and building some of the core components of resilience. You as educators, as administrators, all have the opportunity to be resilience builders. When you have a trauma-informed setting, particularly in schools, trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive schools are showing early indicators of success in the areas of academic improvement, behavior in school, as well as health. But the wonderful thing about this is students aren't the only ones who benefit. Staff in these settings tend to have a greater understanding and knowledge of resilience. You tend to see more positive shifts in the school culture and climate, and staff and educators tend to have increased job satisfaction. It can also lead to some great lifelong success for everyone involved in that trauma-informed setting. So what does it take to become responsive to ACEs and toxic stress? It is a system approach. And as we noted at the beginning, that this is a training. I hope that it is accessible and helpful content, but we really view it as a first step in some of that system change. More often than not, and I'll tell you this is true no matter what sector that I work in, that change really begins with passionate individuals. Influencing long-term change does require that system approach, but I can give you one example in my experience is that I had someone who is kind of similar to a community coordination or care coordinator for the district, happened to be at an ACEs presentation, and she asked me to come in and talk to her superintendent, principal, and vice principal, just to share basic ACEs information. And I said, okay. Coming in and doing that, then they said, we think this information is really important, so we're going to include a whole PD day before school starts on ACEs and trauma-informed care and all the resources in our community. And then to take it a step further, that superintendent also does classes for future school administrators across the state. And so we've worked together to develop some of this curriculum and content for those classes on school administrators. But if I go back to where it started with one passionate individual who heard this information and is making some long-term change and getting the leadership involved in making long-term change. So what does it take? Education-based models around the nation are showing us that there is no one-size-fits-all response. What works in the eastern part of Iowa is not going to work in the west part of the Iowa, will not necessarily work in northern Iowa. It really is understanding your district and your community and the resources that are available. But it does start with a simple understanding that stress impacts not just our brains, but also our bodies. It really leads that shift to asking what's wrong with a student, to understanding what happened to them, or asking what do you need right now. A lot of the behaviors that we see in classes are because students have unmet emotional or physical needs. And so we can look at, from an education perspective, how can we get out in front of that and try to make sure those needs are fulfilled, at least to the extent that the school staff can before the bad behaviors surface. You'll also see here that we talk about it's crucial to understand the interplay of trauma and cultural context. The trauma of our parents and even grandparents can impact the ways we process events. While it's difficult to be fully competent in another person's culture or that family's history, it's important to just be aware and sensitive to the role that culture and history play. So if you look at the school or the community you live in and the different cultural backgrounds, maybe the different socioeconomic levels of your community, how might that be impacting students? Or how may they be impacted by trauma that their families have experienced? So for example, in the area I work in, there are several schools that have high populations of immigrant or refugee youth. And that to be in a trauma-informed school, it's absolutely critical that the staff and the educators involved in those schools are very sensitive to the history that those youth and their families have faced and how it may impact not only what they see in the classroom, but in the interaction with the community and the schools. One reason why change has to be systemic is because we all need support to do our best. So there's a quote here from Dr. Natalie Turner that says, "Stressed brains can't learn, and stressed brains can't teach." We may all be struggling with our own stress responses too. So to show up for students, we have to address our own needs. And healthy systems, healthy schools are supportive, not only for students, but for staff, teachers, administrators alike. So this isn't just about changing things to be better for the students, it's about changing the whole system to be supportive for everyone involved. So we're going to go through the very brief short section here on hope. We've provided some initial information on links to suicide prevention and postvention. SAMHSA is one that they refer to. AEA has some online learning. Other examples that can be implemented today in any district. Again, it looks different in every community and any district. It takes more than one training. But those shifts in policy and the way we model resilience can be done as soon as individuals walk out the door. So first off, rethinking discipline, accountability with grace, meditation, having a reset room instead of taking away recess. This does not mean we don't have high expectations for our students or we don't ensure the safety of all students, but how do we look at our discipline policies? How do we look at how we react to certain behaviors that may be more triggering or trauma-inducing for students and try to reset what those look like. Teaching and practicing self or co-regulation routines. Some examples, some schools do mindfulness classes or trainings. Some even do yoga or meditation. In some cases, it's just teaching breathing techniques and giving time for that, those breathing techniques to occur in all school settings. Teaching and practicing self-care, so things like breaks for teachers and students, supporting colleagues in practicing self-care, supporting all staff with social emotional learning techniques and utilization of health resources. There's some examples here that this isn't about identifying certain students, because we know that childhood and youth can be stressful for all. So if you provide that broad support for students, thinking about early identification of at-risk students and staff. The PBIS system that's used in Iowa can be a great example of this. If we look at some of those all interventions that are universal to provide supports for students, but how can we use some of the higher levels as early identification for social emotional needs in addition to behavioral or academic needs. And where intensive support services or referrals for intensive support services are needed. We also know that supporting kids and families and having that engagement between the school and families and the community is absolutely critical. So thinking about doing activities where there is beyond parent-teacher conferences, where there's engagement with the families to build that relationship for parents to feel supported and to really encourage that partnership. And just looking at some of those in general safe supportive environments in the school.